Boris Becker won Wimbledon 3 times. For a decade, he was the most dangerous fast court player alive, and center court was the room he called his own. And near the end, that same man admitted something champions are not supposed to admit. "There is somebody," he said, "that on my best day and on his best day on the Wimbledon center court, he would beat me." Goran Ivanisevic, the most feared server of his generation, needed no diplomacy at all. "SAMPRAS," he said, "destroyed a large part of my life, my dreams, my hopes, my energy." September 8, 2002, Arthur Ashe Stadium, New York. A 31-year-old seated 17th, a man the papers had spent 2 years calling finished, stands across the net from Andre Agassi with a 14th Grand Slam title resting on his racket. The crowd does not know it yet, but they are watching the last point he will ever play. So who was Pete Sampras really? And why did the men who shared an era with him talk about him less like a rival and more like a sentence being carried out? That is exactly what we are here to find out. Begin with a decision that made no sense. At 14, Pete Sampras had a two-handed backhand and a stack of junior results built on it. His coach, Pete Fisher, looked at that teenager and traded the present for the future. The second hand came off the racket. The junior results collapsed on schedule, and the model for the rebuild was Rod Laver, a champion from a black and white era. The bet was not that the boy would win at 16. The bet was that the man would win Wimbledon. It looked like malpractice. For 2 years, the results made the coach look like a fool. The boy lost to players he used to beat on a backhand he did not yet trust, and nobody apologized for it. Fisher was not building a junior champion. He was building a grown man's game and accepting the bill up front. It turned out to be prophecy, because in September of 1990, at the US Open, the prophecy arrived early. In the quarterfinals, Sampras took down Ivan Lendl and ended the Czech's run of 8 consecutive US Open finals, a streak that had defined an entire decade of the sport. In the semifinals, he beat John McEnroe, the loudest genius New York ever adopted. And in the final, he faced Andre Agassi, the brightest, flashiest star of the new generation, and dismantled him in 3 quick sets. 6-4, 6-3, 6-2. Pete Sampras was 19 years and 28 days old. No man has ever won the US Open younger, not before him, and not since. He had entered that fortnight as a kid with a big serve. He left it with 3 of the biggest names in the sport's history laid out behind him in a single impossible week. The kid had arrived years ahead of schedule. What nobody understood yet was what he intended to do with the entire decade. Start with the serve, because his rivals never stopped talking about it. Same ball toss every single time, flat out wide, kicker to the body, slider down the middle, all launched from an identical, unreadable cradle. Returners were not reacting to the serve, they were guessing at it. Professionals build careers on reading a toss, the tilt of a shoulder, the angle of a wrist, the ball drifting an inch to one side. Against Sampras, there was nothing to read. The greatest returners of the age stood on that baseline knowing exactly how much it mattered, and guessed anyway. And behind the first serve lived the true weapon, a second serve that players and broadcasters of his era described as the greatest the game had ever seen, a stroke most professionals treat as survival, turned into a threat. First serves win points. Second serves reveal nerves. They are where champions get careful. His refused to be careful. On break point, in a 5th set, under every kind of weight, the second serve arrived with the same conviction as the first, and it broke something in the men waiting for it. When the machine was fully assembled, the numbers stopped looking like tennis and started looking like a verdict. 286 weeks ranked number 1 in the world. And then the record that still stands untouched. Not 1, not 2. 6 consecutive seasons finished as the year-end number 1. 1993 through 1998. Read that again. 6 straight years. And not Federer, not Nadal, not Djokovic, none of them, in all their glory, ever matched it. A year-end number 1 is not a hot month. It is 11 months of defending everything, everywhere, against everyone, and he did it 6 times without surrendering a single finish line. On grass, the verdict was harsher still. 7 Wimbledon titles in 8 years, from 1993 to 2000, with a single defeat in between. His rivals were not losing a tennis match, they were being processed by one. But the ache underneath the machine was already there, it just had not been given a name yet. Here is the part of the story that does not fit. The public had chosen its favorite and it was not him. Andre Agassi had the hair, the denim, the cameras, the noise. Image was, famously, everything. Sampras had a serve and a stare. One of them turned every arena into a concert. The other one showed up, held serve for 3 hours, shook hands, and left. The public made its choice. The scoreboard made a different one. 34 times they walked onto a court together across 13 years, and when it was over, the ledger read 20-14 for the quiet one. And it had opened with a message, that final in 1990, when a teenager with no reputation dismantled the most famous young player alive in straight sets on the biggest stage his country owns. It was not a rivalry the way the posters sold it. It was a verdict, delivered 34 times, and Agassi felt it more deeply than anyone. Years later, an 8-time major champion who had spent his whole career across that net wrote it down in his own book. I envy Pete's dullness. I wish I could emulate his spectacular lack of inspiration, and his peculiar lack of need for inspiration. On the page it reads like an insult. Inside a locker room it reads like a confession. The flashiest man of his generation admitting that the boring one carried something he could not manufacture. It is one thing to lose to a man for 13 years. It is another thing entirely to sit down, long after the losing is over, and write that his emptiness was the thing you envied. What that something did to the rest of the tour is a story best told in 3 quick rounds. Round 1. Wimbledon, 1995, the final. Becker, 3 titles on that lawn, the king of the place for a decade, took the opening set from him in a tiebreak. It was the last thing he took. Sampras answered with the next 3 sets, and when it ended, the German did not talk about tactics. He talked about surrender. This, he admitted, was the man who could beat his best with room to spare. The keys to center court changed hands that afternoon, and everyone in the building knew it. Round 2, the streak itself. From 1993 to 2000, exactly one man on the planet solved Wimbledon against him, Richard Krajicek, once in '96. 1 loss in 8 summers on the sport's biggest stage. Entire careers came and went inside that window without ever touching the trophy he treated like luggage. Grass was supposed to be the great equalizer, the surface where one hot server could steal a fortnight. For 8 summers, nobody stole anything. Round 3, July 9th, 2000. A rain-delayed final against Patrick Rafter slides into the London dusk, and Sampras serves 27 aces through the failing light. When the last one lands, it is his 13th major, one more than Roy Emerson, a record that had stood for decades, and the man the press called a robot climbs over photographers into the stands in tears to reach his parents. They had flown in quietly, and it was the first time in his life they had watched him win a Grand Slam final live. 27 aces, a record older than his own career, and a man in tears climbing toward his mother and father, all inside the same hour. Machines do not climb into crowds. Which brings us to the part of this story the highlight reels leave out. The word they hung on him through the mid-90s was boring. Too quiet, too efficient, no rage, no theater, a metronome in a sport that wanted rock stars. The truth behind the metronome was standing in his coaching box, and in January of 1995, the truth collapsed. Tim Gullickson, the coach who had rebuilt Sampras into a Wimbledon champion, and his closest friend, fell gravely ill in Melbourne and was flown home. The diagnosis was brain cancer. Days later, in the quarterfinal against Jim Courier, Sampras fell 2 sets down. Somewhere in the crowd, a voice cut through the Melbourne night, "Do it for your coach." Sampras would always insist he never heard it. But right around that moment, the most controlled man in professional sport began to weep, openly, in the middle of the match, and kept serving aces through the tears. He won in 5. The papers that had called him a robot printed his crying face the next morning. Tim Gullickson died on May 3rd, 1996. He was 44. 4 months later, at the US Open, Sampras played a quarterfinal against Alex Corretja that lasted 4 hours and 9 minutes. Deep in the 5th set tiebreak, his body simply gave out. He vomited on the court, swaying between points, barely able to stand. He lived his whole career, quietly, with a mild inherited anemia documented in his own memoir, and on that evening every cost of it was on display. And then, from somewhere, he produced a 25th ace to reach match point territory and watched Corretja double fault the war away. He said he did it for Tim, the papers reported the next day. His own memory of the aftermath was simpler. "I went right into the doctor's office and collapsed. He won that championship." But bodies keep their own ledger. After Wimbledon of 2000, the title stopped, not for a month, but for 2 full years. 33 tournaments without a trophy. The number 1 of 6 straight seasons fell to a 17th seed, and the columns that once called him boring began calling him done. And the ache he carried is not exclusive to legends, because the body keeps its own scoreboard, whatever the name on it. Most of the people watching this never served on center court, but plenty still serve on Tuesdays. The same motion, the same one-handed backhand, and that small ache on Wednesday morning, the elbow, the shoulder, the lower back, that gets a little less small every season. It is Sampras's price, paid in smaller coins. And here the story brushes against something newer. Recent research points to a cause of that pain in players over 40 that almost nobody in this sport talks about. This video is not the place where it gets explained, it has its own. You will find it pinned as the first comment under this one, and it asks for nothing but a few minutes before your next match. SAMPRAS, for his part, never asked his body for mercy. What he asked for instead is the reason this story has an ending at all. There is a particular kind of respect that only appears when the microphones point at the defeated, and SAMPRAS collected more of it than any man of his time. Becker, 3 Wimbledons, the owner of Center Court until the owner changed, said the existence of Pete Sampras was part of the reason he walked away from tennis. For me, he said, that was the reason I wanted to retire. Consider the weight of that concession. Ivan Nisevich, who lost 2 Wimbledon finals to him, kept a running tally of the damage. He ruined my dreams, my hopes, my energy. I am the unluckiest player who ever lived. Jim Courier, a 4-time major champion, learned in Melbourne that not even grief would blunt the man across the net. And by the late 90s, the tour had quietly changed its vocabulary. Players stopped talking about beating Pete Sampras and started talking about surviving him. Even Agassi's book, the most honest document that era ever produced, spends its Sampras pages not on the 14 matches he won, but on what the other 20 did to him. Read the testimony back to back. A 3-time champion citing him as a reason to leave the sport. A Wimbledon champion calling him the ruin of his dreams, the greatest showman of the generation admitting envy in print. They were not describing a tennis player anymore. They were describing weather, which returns us to New York, September of 2002, where this story began. The 17th seed, 33 tournaments without a title, against Andre Agassi, of course it was Agassi, with the whole era on the line one last time. Sampras won it in 4, 6-3, 6-4, 5-7, 6-4. A 5th US Open tying Jimmy Connors at the top of the list. The oldest champion New York had crowned in over 3 decades, a 14th Grand Slam title, and then nothing. He never played another professional match. The man who was supposed to be finished on his own terms. The only man of his era to win the very last major he ever entered. To beat a rival like Andre in a storybook ending, he said that night, it might be nice to stop. He would later call the last match of his career the best he ever played. So the question from the beginning answers itself. The public called him boring for a decade. The men across the net never used that word. They used words like the reason I wanted to retire. The boredom was the mask. The terror was the man wearing it. That was not a career. That was a sentence the rest of an era served. If the true stories of this game's legends deserve to stay alive, subscribe and follow the next one. Then leave a comment. Which champion should walk onto center court in our next story? Until then, the record still says 14, and the serve, even in memory, still has no tell.